You know that feeling when your heart sinks before your mind fully understands why? That was me, sitting in a beige-walled conference room with stale coffee in the corner and a closed door behind me. I should have known something was off the moment I was called in without notice. But I walked in anyway, clutching my notepad like it could shield me from whatever was coming. ***. My name is Jenna Patel. I am 36 years old, born and raised in Columbus, Ohio. I have been a senior compliance manager at OrionVantage Group for the last 11 years. I built my career from the ground up, stayed late more times than I can count, skipped birthdays, vacations, and sometimes even meals, all in the name of loyalty and professionalism. And in that moment, all of it felt like a cruel joke. Reed Langford sat across the table from me, wearing his usual smug expression and overpriced cologne that filled the room like poison. He slid a folder across the table without saying a word. I opened it slowly. Inside was a resignation letter, already typed, formatted, and dated. My name was there, clear as day. The implication was obvious: sign it, and walk away quietly. I looked up at him, and that was when he said it. Sign it now, or I will make sure you are never hired in this industry again. His voice was cold, deliberate. My stomach turned, and for a second, I thought I might actually throw up. My hands were trembling under the table, but I kept my expression steady. If he thought I would break that easily, he was in for a surprise. For the past 3 years, Reed had made it his mission to chip away at me, professionally and personally. At first, it was subtle. He would forget to invite me to key meetings or present my ideas as his own during quarterly reviews. Then it got worse. He criticized my tone in emails, called me too assertive in front of junior staff, and wrote performance notes that conveniently left out my results. I hit every metric. My team reduced audit delays by nearly 40% under my leadership. But Reed never acknowledged that. Instead, he made sure I looked like a problem. And I knew why. I was the only person in that department who asked questions he did not want to answer. So now, here he was, trying to finish what he started. Forcing me into a corner, hoping fear would do the rest. What he did not know was that I had seen this coming. I had already spoken to an attorney weeks before. I had been documenting every meeting, every slight, every strange financial directive he pushed across my desk. And while I was scared, I was not powerless. That realization gave me just enough strength to sit up a little straighter, to breathe through the panic. I looked at the paper in front of me. The heading read, "Voluntary Resignation." I almost laughed. Voluntary? There was nothing voluntary about this. Reed stood up and said, "I will give you a few minutes. But do not take too long. We can make this clean or messy, it is your choice." Then he walked out, letting the door click shut behind him like some kind of final warning. I stared at the document again, and something in me cracked. Not the kind of crack that means you are broken. The kind that lets the light in. I was tired of playing it safe. Tired of letting men like Reed win just because they knew how to manipulate. Fear. My whole career, I had been taught to stay professional, stay composed, pick my battles. But this? This was war disguised as HR protocol. I reached for my pen and hovered it above the line with my name. My hands were still shaking, but now it was with anger, not fear. I took a breath. I knew this was a risk. But I had spent too long swallowing my voice, watching other people get promoted for work I had done, pretending like everything was fine. It was not fine. And I was not going to let him bury me quietly. Not today. Not ever. So I clicked the pen, stared at the word voluntary, and thought to myself, let us see how he likes it when the rules are not in his favor anymore. Looking back, the signs were all there. They did not come in one dramatic wave. They crept in slowly, like water seeping under a door, quiet, unnoticed, and dangerous. It started with the little things. My ideas would suddenly show up in department meetings, but not from me. Reed would present them as if they had just occurred to him. I remember one in particular, a new compliance protocol that I had spent weeks perfecting. He read it out loud to the leadership team word for word from the document I had emailed him privately. When I brought it up afterward, hoping maybe it was some kind of oversight, he chuckled and said, "You should take it as a compliment. Not everyone gets their ideas used at the top." My jaw clenched. I smiled politely. And that was the first time I told myself, just let it go. But letting it go turned into a habit. A dangerous one. Because the more I let slide, the bolder he became. Reed started excluding me from planning meetings I had always been part of. I would see them on his calendar or hear my teammates talk about them afterward. When I asked him directly, he said, "We are trying to streamline communication. Too many cooks in the kitchen." It did not matter that I was the one who built the kitchen to begin with. I was slowly being cut out of my own role. It was like watching someone slowly erase your name from the credits of a film you directed. And no matter how hard I worked or how clean my reports were, the message was clear: my presence was no longer welcome. One time, a major client asked for me by name. They had worked with me for years and trusted my guidance. Reed told them I was reassigned to another area and sent in someone new. The client was confused, even frustrated. I only found out when they emailed me directly. When I asked Reed why he lied, he responded with a flat expression and said, "You have been a bit too visible lately. It is better if we shift the spotlight." That line haunted me. Too visible. In a job where performance and clarity were everything, I was being punished for being effective. That was the twisted brilliance of Reed's manipulation. He never needed to yell or raise his voice. He just calmly undermined me until I began questioning myself. Eventually, the internal write-ups began. At first, they were subtle, hidden inside performance evaluations. Lacks collaborative spirit. Needs improvement in communication. Displays a tendency toward independent decision-making without group consensus. None of them matched reality. I was leading the most efficient team in the department. Our audit accuracy numbers had gone up by 38%. But those metrics were nowhere to be found in the reports Reed sent to HR. Instead, he painted me as difficult, distant, and disengaged. He made me out to be the kind of employee who caused friction, when in fact, I had spent years smoothing it out for others. I remember going home one evening after receiving a particularly harsh email from Reed about my failure to loop in leadership on a budget review. I sat on my couch in silence, staring at the screen, trying to remember when I had stopped trusting myself. I used to love my job. I believed in the systems, the integrity, the rules. But now, everything felt twisted. I was constantly second-guessing my own memory, wondering if I was the one who misunderstood, the one who needed to improve. That is what gaslighting does. It does not just make you doubt your actions. It makes you doubt your worth. Still, I kept working. I told myself that if I just pushed through a little longer, things would get better. Maybe Reed would transfer. Maybe someone in upper leadership would notice. But they never did. Or if they did, they stayed silent. And I was not brave enough, yet, to say anything louder than a whisper. So I stayed. I did my job. I kept notes. And I waited. I was not ready then. But a small part of me knew that one day, I would be. Because no matter how buried I felt, I was not broken. And even in the middle of that storm, something in me was starting to shift. It started with a number. Just a number. A vendor invoice for $38,000 that, at first glance, looked perfectly routine. But I had seen that name before, and I remembered it being half that amount just a few months earlier. I opened the older files and began comparing the details side by side. There was no change in the service provided. No additional line items, no new projects, no revised contract. The payment had simply doubled. And no one had flagged it. No one had asked why. That did not sit right with me. In compliance, when something feels off, it usually is. We were not supposed to ignore our instincts, at least, that was what I believed before working under Reed Langford. I pulled more reports, digging back 4, 5, 6 months. At first, it was just that one vendor. Then it became 3. Then 6. The pattern was too clean to be random. In each case, the service description stayed the same, but the payments gradually increased over time, always just below the threshold that would require secondary approvals. That was not carelessness. That was strategy. Someone knew how to game the system. I looked at the approvals, and every one of them had Reed's digital signature. I flagged the files and sent a quiet note to him directly, asking if these vendor relationships had been renegotiated or if we had new scope details that were not properly documented. He replied 2 hours later with a one-line email. Leave. Financial audits to finance, Jenna. Focus on your role. I read that line over and over again. It made no sense. Compliance and finance were separate, yes, but we were responsible for ensuring procedures were followed, especially when it came to vendor vetting and payment limits. If anything, it was my job to ask those questions. His response was not just dismissive, it was defensive. That was the first time I truly felt like something was being hidden. And not just from me. From the entire company. I went home that night with a tightness in my chest that would not go away. I opened my personal laptop, poured a cup of tea I never drank, and began backing up every report I had access to. Vendor files, internal memos, emails, payment trails, anything tied to the names I had seen pop up. I saved everything twice, once on a password-protected drive and once to a cloud folder only I could access. I had never done anything like that before. It felt sneaky, maybe even wrong. But somewhere deep inside, I knew I could not afford to ignore the feeling in my gut. I was not accusing anyone. Not yet. But I was not going to be blindsided if things escalated. Over the next few weeks, I kept digging during early mornings and late nights. I searched for contracts, invoices, and audit trails. And what I found made my stomach turn. There were patterns that pointed to favoritism, missing documentation, and, in some cases, outright conflicts of interest. One vendor had the same mailing address as a company that Reed's brother-in-law used on LinkedIn. Another had no verifiable business registration. These were not just sloppy mistakes. They looked like they were designed to slip through the cracks, assuming no one would ever take a second look. And until now, no one had. What hurt the most was realizing how long it had been happening. This was not some sudden lapse in judgment. It was a system. And I had been working right next to it the entire time, unaware. I started noticing the way Reed avoided eye contact when I walked into the room. The way he would intercept documents before they reached the audit committee. I stopped sleeping through the night. My dreams were filled with spreadsheets and silence. With unanswered emails and voices telling me to keep my head down. But I could not. Not anymore. Every piece of evidence I gathered made me feel both stronger and more afraid. Stronger, because I was finally seeing the truth. Afraid, because I knew what Reed was capable of. He had already tried to erase me from my own job. What would he do if he realized I had a file full of inconsistencies tied to his name? I did not know. But I kept going. Quietly. Carefully. Because once you see a red flag, you cannot unsee it. And the truth, no matter how buried, was starting to rise. It is strange how the smallest moments stay with you, the way someone pauses before answering a question, the tone behind a casual remark, or a file that disappears and then reappears edited. I started paying closer attention to those details. Not just because they seemed off, but because they repeated. Reed was consistent in the way he twisted things. When people asked about missed reports, he blamed team delays. When deadlines were tight, he said we needed to cut corners to stay competitive. At first, those phrases sounded like typical corporate nonsense. But after what I had uncovered in the vendor payments, those words felt more like warnings. So I started keeping track. Every slight, every shady directive, every time I was publicly discredited or silently pushed out of conversations, I wrote it down. Not in a notebook, not on the company network. I kept a private journal on a password-protected flash drive, one that never left my purse. I documented dates, names, exact wording, even the time of day. If someone casually mentioned Reed's tendency to get around protocols, I logged it. If I got copied on an email that suddenly disappeared from the thread the next day, I saved it. I was not building a case out of spite. I was building it for protection. Because Reed had power, and I knew it. But I also knew paper trails tell the truth even when people will not. After weeks of collecting data, I reached out to someone outside the company. Her name was Maya Carter. She was an employment attorney in her late 30s with a sharp voice and the kind of calm that makes you feel like you are already halfway safe just by speaking to her. I sent her a brief summary, just a few lines and a request for a meeting. She responded that same day. When we finally spoke, I laid it all out, the files, the vendor payments, the hostile interactions, the write-ups that made no sense, and Reed's warning when I flagged the numbers. Maya listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "You may be in more danger than you think, but you are not powerless." That sentence changed everything for me. Not just because it was true, but because it reminded me that I was not crazy. The things I had seen, the way I had been treated, the numbers that did not add up, those were not accidents or overreactions. They were part of something bigger, and I had been right to trust my instincts. Maya explained that constructive dismissal, hostile work environments, and retaliation all carry legal weight if documented properly. She also told me that the way Reed had tried to isolate me from clients and key meetings could indicate a pattern of workplace suppression. That gave me the clarity I had been craving. I was not being dramatic. I was being smart. After that call, I felt more focused than I had in months. Maya advised me to stay calm, follow normal protocols, and avoid confrontation while we built a solid timeline. She helped me word a few emails to HR that would not raise suspicion but would quietly begin creating a record. I forwarded her my findings, including the vendor inconsistencies, and she confirmed that the evidence suggested more than just negligence, it hinted at possible fraud. We agreed that I should continue working as usual, but with an eye toward the moment when the truth would need to come to light. I knew I had to play it carefully. Reed was not the kind of person who left obvious footprints. But he was careless in his confidence. He believed no one would ever question him seriously. That arrogance was a blind spot. And I was going to use it. I doubled down on my work, kept my head down in meetings, and played the part of the quiet team player. But behind the scenes, I was preparing for the day it would all come crashing down. Every ignored email, every altered report, every whispered complaint from a teammate who was too scared to speak up, I kept collecting. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted justice. And justice starts with the truth. Even when it comes quietly. Even when no one is ready to hear it. It is amazing how one word can carry the weight of your entire story. One word. One quiet, deliberate change. That was all it took to shift the power back into my hands, even if only for a moment. That morning, when Reed called me into his office. Without warning, I knew something was coming. I could feel it in the way he refused to meet my eyes, in the way he clicked his pen like a ticking clock. The air in the room was sharp and tight, like everything inside it had been waiting to explode. And then he handed me the document, neatly typed, perfectly formatted, waiting for my signature. The heading read, Voluntary Resignation. My name sat underneath, bold and clear, with a space for my signature and the date. I had seen it coming, but not like this. Reed leaned back in his chair like it was already done. This is the cleanest way out, he said. Sign it now, and we will call it a mutual decision. No harm, no scandal. You can even use me as a reference. His voice was almost sweet, like he was offering me a favor. But I saw through it. This was not an opportunity. It was a trap. One final move to erase me without noise, without consequence. When I did not answer right away, he stood up, pulled out his phone, and said, "Take your time. I will be back in a few minutes." Then he walked out and closed the door behind him. I stared at the document. My heart was racing, but not from fear this time. It was from clarity. I had spent 3 years watching my work be stolen, my presence diminished, my name twisted into something it was not. I had stayed quiet to protect my career, to keep the peace, to give the benefit of the doubt. But now, with that piece of paper sitting in front of me, I realized this was not just about me. It was about the system he thought he could keep bending. I opened my purse slowly, pulled out a black ink pen, and held it in my hand for a long moment. Then I did something I had never done before. I crossed out the word voluntary. Just one line through it, clean, straight, undeniable. And above it, in small but clear letters, I wrote, constructive dismissal due to retaliatory behavior and hostile work environment. My hands were steady. I had written those words in my journal 100 times. But this time, they were not just a record. They were a statement. I signed the bottom, dated it, and looked at the document one last time. Then, calmly and without hesitation, I slid the original copy into my purse and placed the modified version back on his desk exactly where he had left it. When Reed returned, I was already standing. He looked at me, slightly confused by how calm I seemed. I nodded once, politely, and said, "It is signed." He smirked, as if he had won something. But he did not pick up the paper right away. And I did not wait for him to. I walked out of that office and down the hallway without looking back. Each step felt like shedding a layer I had been forced to wear. Fear, silence, exhaustion, they started to lift with every stride I took. By the time I reached the elevator, I was already dialing Maya, my attorney. When she picked up, I simply said, "It is done." I left him the rewritten version. She paused for just a second before replying, "Good. Now let us begin." That night, I could finally breathe. Not because everything was over, but because something new had started. I had made my move. Quiet, firm, and backed by months of evidence. I had not yelled, had not thrown a scene, had not begged for fairness. I had just written the truth, plain and simple, and put it where it could no longer be ignored. Reed thought. He had silenced me with a piece of paper. But what he handed me was the very tool I would use to pull everything into the light. One word. That was all it took. One word, and the game changed. That night, after walking out of Reed's office with the original resignation letter tucked safely in my purse, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the email I was about to send. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I tried to steady my breath. I had written the draft earlier, just in case the day ever came. I never really thought I would have to send it, but here I was. I attached the modified document, included my journal notes, the vendor records, and a summary of events, just the facts, no emotion. Then I addressed it to 3 people: Maya Carter, my attorney, Clara Mooney, our Director of Human Resources, and Dwayne Kessler, the CEO of OrionVantage Group. I read it twice, clicked send, and sat in the silence of my apartment as the weight of it all settled in. I barely slept that night. My mind was racing with what ifs. What if they ignored it? What if Reed got ahead of me? What if this ruined everything I had worked for? But deep down, I knew there was no turning back. The truth was out now. The next morning, I received a calendar invite from Clara, urgent review meeting, 9:30 a.m. I arrived early. The room was quiet when I entered. Clara was already seated, along with a member of the legal team I had never met and a senior HR investigator. The energy in the room was thick with caution. They greeted me formally, no small talk. I handed them a printed copy of what I had sent the night before. Clara looked at me with something between worry and admiration. I could tell she had read every word. Her voice was calm but serious when she finally said, "This is serious. We are suspending Reed until we figure this out." I did not smile. I did not feel victorious. All I felt was a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief that I was finally being heard. Dread for what was about to come. The legal advisor asked me to walk through the timeline again. I recounted the altered resignation letter, the financial irregularities, the patterns of retaliation, and the hostile environment Reed had created. They asked clarifying questions, took notes, and thanked me for bringing everything forward. After the meeting, I was asked to work remotely while they conducted the investigation. I packed up a few essentials from my desk quietly, trying not to draw attention. Some coworkers noticed, but no one said anything. Word spreads fast in corporate hallways, even when people pretend not to know. By noon, Reed's office door was closed with a sign that read, "Access restricted." It was subtle, but loud enough for those who had been watching closely. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in the eyes of the team. They had known something was wrong, but no one had said it out loud until now. Maya called me that afternoon. Her voice was steady and professional as always. She told me I had taken a big step and that the company's reaction so far was a good sign. "They are treating this seriously," she said. "You did everything right, Jenna. Now let them do what they need to do." I nodded even though she could not see me. I needed to hear those words. Because even when you know the truth is on your side, standing alone and it still feels heavy. The next few days were a blur of emails, statements, and phone calls. I submitted digital copies of everything. Clara kept me updated as the review expanded. They began pulling emails, reviewing expense logs, and interviewing staff. Reed did not return to the office. Rumors flew, but no one had the full story. I stayed quiet, working from home, answering questions only when asked. I wanted to believe the system would do its job. I had taken the risk. Now I had to trust the process. What surprised me most was the number of quiet messages I received from colleagues. Some said nothing more than, "Thank you." Others shared their own experiences, moments when they were silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. It was the first time I realized that this was bigger than me. Reed's behavior had touched more people than I knew. And now that one voice had broken the silence, others were finding theirs too. The fallout had begun. But so had the change. When the internal audit team began digging, I do not think any of them expected what they were about to uncover. The investigation had started as a narrow look into one resignation and a few questionable vendor payments. But it quickly turned into something much bigger. Within a week, they discovered that I had not been the only person Reed Langford had targeted. In fact, my story followed a pattern, one that had repeated itself more than once over the past 2 years. Quiet exits. Sudden resignations. Strong performers who left without explanation. What was once seen as high turnover started to look like deliberate removal. At least 4 other women had been pressured into resigning under similar circumstances. 2 had left within months of being praised in internal reviews. Another had been removed from a major project after challenging Reed's approach during a leadership meeting. The 4th, according to her file, had requested mediation through HR before quietly disappearing just weeks later. None of them had filed formal complaints. There were no investigations. Just goodbye emails and exit interviews that read like they had been written under duress. It was like peeling back layers of wallpaper and finding the same mold hidden underneath each one. The audit team flagged these resignations and started reviewing Reed's communications. Emails, performance reports, internal messages, all of it was examined. The language he used was consistent. He labeled outspoken women as difficult to manage. He claimed that collaboration was lacking when a team member challenged his decisions. If someone requested clarity on policy, he described them as rigid or resistant to change. He knew how to make strong employees look like troublemakers, and for a while, no one questioned him. He played the part of a polished leader while quietly dismantling the people who threatened his control. But the part that stunned even the audit team was where the money led. The vendor payments I had flagged? The ones that had mysteriously doubled over time? They traced those to a shell company registered in another state. On paper, it looked legitimate. A professional name, a generic service description, even a website that seemed functional if you did not look too closely. But someone on the team ran the registration through a deeper corporate search. And what they found connected the company to Reed's brother-in-law, an accountant based in another city who had no previous business ties to OrionVantage Group, that changed everything. What had started as a workplace conflict had just turned into a potential case of fraud. Now legal, compliance, and external forensic auditors were involved. They launched a full review of every vendor approved by Reed over the last 5 years. The totals were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled into suspicious accounts, all signed off under Reed's authority. It was no longer about mistreatment or workplace culture. It was about financial crime. And I had the sickening realization that I had been working just a few feet away from it all, day after day, while he smiled in meetings and shook hands with executives. I stayed quiet while the investigation continued. Clara, the HR director, kept me informed when she could, though much of it had moved beyond her reach. The CEO, Dwayne Kessler, was briefed personally. From what I was told, he was furious, not just at the fraud, but at how the abuse had gone unchecked for so long. Reed had built a network of silence, one that relied on people being too scared or too exhausted to speak. And for a while, it had worked. But now the cracks were wide open, and nothing he said could cover them up again. What shocked me most was how many people had suspected something, but never felt empowered to say it. Colleagues began coming forward with emails they had saved, conversations they remembered, red flags they had dismissed. It was like everyone had been holding their breath for years. And now, finally, they were exhaling. I was not alone anymore. The silence was breaking, and with it, the illusion that Reed had built. What we were uncovering was not just a toxic manager, it was a system of manipulation, intimidation, and theft that had gone unchecked for far too long. And now, finally, the truth had a voice. When Dwayne Kessler, the CEO of OrionVantage Group, walked into the company-wide town hall meeting, the energy in the room shifted. There was no sleek presentation, no staged applause. Just him, standing at the front with a microphone and a hard truth. He took a long breath before speaking, and when he did, his voice was firm but stripped of corporate polish. "We failed our people," he said. "This ends now." The room fell into a silence that felt almost electric. No one moved. No one whispered. It was the first time someone at the top had acknowledged that what happened to me, and others, was not just unfortunate. It was unacceptable. He laid everything out plainly. Reed Langford was under investigation not only for unethical behavior but for possible financial misconduct. An external firm had been brought in to audit the past 5 years of vendor contracts. HR would no longer report through department heads but directly to an independent oversight team. No employee, Dwayne said, should feel like telling. The truth will cost them their career. It was more than a statement. It was a shift in the way the company had always operated, where fear, silence, and gatekeeping had defined so much of the culture. Within a week, major changes began to roll out. Dwayne authorized the creation of a direct reporting line to HR that completely bypassed managers. Anyone, regardless of title or tenure, could submit complaints directly, and those submissions would go to a third-party service with full anonymity. That meant no more retaliation, no more whisper networks, no more looking the other way because someone feared getting blacklisted. For many of us, it was the first time in years that the company felt like a place that might actually listen. New leadership ethics training became mandatory, not just a checkbox course, but a serious, multi-day program led by experts from outside the company. Every executive, director, and manager had to attend. It covered power dynamics, retaliation patterns, unconscious bias, and the responsibility leaders had to protect, not control, their teams. People could not fake their way through it. Attendance was monitored, and participation was tracked. If you missed it or dismissed it, you were removed from leadership consideration. There was also a thorough review of exit interviews from the last 5 years. Clara and her newly expanded HR team combed through every single file, searching for patterns of forced resignations or suspiciously vague notes. They reached out to former employees, especially those whose departures were tied to Reed or his division. Some were too exhausted to reopen old wounds, but others stepped forward with documents and messages they had saved, proof of intimidation, withheld feedback, and retaliatory write-ups. Their voices added weight to the case, showing that Reed's behavior had not been isolated, but systemic. I watched all of this unfold with a strange mix of relief and grief. Part of me was grateful. The system that had allowed people like Reed to thrive unchecked was finally cracking. But another part of me could not ignore how long it had taken. So many people had been hurt, silenced, or pushed out before anyone listened. For every change that was now being made, there were names and faces that came to mind, people I had worked with, respected, and quietly watched disappear. Still, change was happening. Reed had been suspended indefinitely, his access revoked and his office cleared out by security. His name no longer appeared on internal memos or leadership boards. New hires were now briefed on the company's zero-tolerance policy around retaliation and ethics violations. The culture, which once rewarded silence and punished resistance, was beginning to turn a corner. Dwayne ended that same town hall by saying, "It should not have taken this much for us to see it. But now that we do, we are going to do better." And for the first time, I believed him. Because it was no longer about one woman's experience or one manager's downfall. It was about rewriting the rules of how power was used, and misused, inside those walls. The house was finally being cleaned. And we were no longer pretending that it had not been dirty in the first place. Exactly 1 month after everything came to light, I received an unexpected calendar invite from Dwayne. The subject line just said, "Let's talk." I walked into his office not knowing what to expect. He closed the door behind me, offered a cup of tea instead of coffee, and sat across from me with a calm seriousness. "We need someone who has lived this," he said. "Someone who understands not just policy, but people. I want you to consider becoming our first director of workplace integrity." For a moment, I could not respond. I was still processing the fact that this company, this place that nearly broke me, was now asking me to help rebuild it. I accepted the role after 2 days of thinking it through. Not out of ego. Not out of revenge. But because I knew I could do the work in a way no one else could. I had sat in the shadows of that building for years, hearing the whispers, seeing the double standards, feeling the weight of speaking up in a place that punished truth. If I was going to stay, it had to mean something. And now, I had the power to make sure it did. The title was new. The mission was clear. I was not here to cover up. I was here to clean up. One of my first priorities was to reach out to two former colleagues who had been wrongfully terminated under Reed's watch. Both had left quietly, without fanfare, after being written up for vague infractions that were clearly retaliatory. One was Lila, a brilliant project coordinator who caught a mistake in a financial report and was suddenly labeled disruptive. The other was Marcus, a junior analyst who asked too many questions in a meeting and was written up for undermining leadership. I called them both personally. I told them the truth. I apologized, not just as a leader, but as someone who had been through it, too. And I asked if they would come back. To my relief, they both said yes. At the same time, I pushed for the promotion of the one person who had quietly supported me when things got dark, Noah. He had been overlooked for years, often dismissed as too reserved by managers who never noticed how observant and thoughtful he truly was. When Reed would cut me off in meetings, Noah would circle back to my points. When I was left out of email chains, he would forward the threads to me. Without comment, without drama, just quiet decency. Promoting him to senior analyst was not just a professional decision. It was personal. He deserved to lead. And now, he would the changes we started implementing were not just policy tweaks. They were cultural shifts. We introduced listening sessions across all departments, where employees could speak openly with facilitators who were not tied to leadership. We created mentorship programs for women and underrepresented staff, with real accountability metrics attached. And we started a bi-weekly internal newsletter that highlighted stories of ethical courage, small moments where people did the right thing, even when it was hard. But more than anything, we worked to destroy the idea that silence was safer than truth. That culture had been embedded into the company's DNA for far too long. It was subtle, passed down through looks, ignored complaints, and just keep your head down conversations. We replaced it with something else, trust backed by action. Not empty promises. Real responses. Real follow-through. Real consequences. There were still skeptics. There were still bruises. Not everyone trusted that the change would last, and honestly, I understood that. When you have been burned once, you do not stick your hand out again so easily. But day by day, moment by moment, we were earning it back. And we did it without pretending the past had not happened. We kept it visible. We owned it. I did not set out to be a leader in this way. I never wanted power. I wanted fairness, respect, safety. The kind of workplace where people could come in, do good work, and go home with their dignity intact. Now, that was the mission. And I was no longer fighting alone. It was a crisp, cold morning when I stepped into the courtroom. The kind of morning where the sky looks too blue and the air too sharp, as if the world itself wants to remind you that change does not come easy. I took a deep breath as I entered, my heels clicking against the tile floor like a metronome counting down to something final. Reed Langford was sitting at the defendant's table, no longer in a tailored suit but a plain gray one, his expression unreadable. I had once feared this man. I had once believed he could destroy my career with a few emails. Now, he sat silently, surrounded by attorneys, waiting to hear the outcome of his own undoing. The trial had taken months. The evidence I had quietly gathered, combined with the internal audit and the testimonies of several former employees, painted a damning picture. Fraud, coercion, workplace retaliation, falsification of financial records, it was all there, documented and cross-checked. What shocked me most was how deep it went. Reed had not just bullied a few staffers. He had built a system where silence was currency, where fear was strategy. That system had allowed him to funnel nearly $500,000 through a shell company tied to his brother-in-law. It had allowed him to discredit employees who questioned him. It had nearly broken me. The judge read the sentence without emotion. 5 years in federal prison. No parole for the first 3. Mandatory restitution. When it was over, Reed stood for a moment, like he might say something. But he did not. He was escorted out of the courtroom, and just like that, it was done. I sat there for a moment longer, letting it all land. It was not joy I felt. Not triumph. Just weight. The kind of weight that makes you sit a little straighter because you finally realize what you were carrying all that time. After the sentencing, I stepped outside and felt the sun warm my face. Reporters stood nearby, but none approached me. I was not the story they were chasing. Not that day. and that was fine. Because the real victory was not in Reed's punishment. It was in the prevention of the next Reed. It was in the new policies, the changed culture, the employees who now felt seen and safe. It was in the simple but powerful reality that I had taken one small, deliberate action, and it had changed everything. When I first edited that resignation letter, I had no idea where it would lead. I just knew I could not sign away my career on a lie. Changing voluntary resignation to constructive dismissal had felt like a whisper at the time. But it became a roar. That one word gave me legal standing. It triggered the review. It forced HR to take action. And eventually, it brought years of buried misconduct into the light. One word. That was all it took to shift the balance of power. Not all at once. Not easily. But enough to matter. I still think about that moment sometimes, sitting in his office, the pen in my hand, my fingers trembling. I had every reason to be scared. But I also had every reason to speak. And that made all the difference. Today, I stand not just as a survivor of workplace injustice, but as someone who helped dismantle it from the inside. And I did not do it with rage or revenge. I did it with resolve. With clarity. With the belief that no one should have to choose between their job and their dignity. There is a saying I once read, justice is not always loud, but it is always deliberate. I understand that now in a way I never did before. My story is not unique. There are thousands of Jennas in offices. All over the world, people being dismissed, gaslit, silenced. If there is one thing I hope they take from this, it is this: speak up. Document everything. Find your allies. And never underestimate the power of your own voice. Because sometimes, all it takes is one word. Just one, to start everything.